All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular, the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class for the fall 2019 semester, I have been creating a series of video presentations based on the textbook that will be used for this class, the one shown on screen, which is Pro ASP.NET MVC 5, an A-Press text by Adam Freeman. I am in Chapter 25 of 27, and we're halfway down on page 731, talking about performing client-side validation. The author mentions here that thus far, all of the validation techniques that have been demonstrated have been server-side validation, meaning that it takes place after the user has attempted to submit his or her data to the server. It's the server that's validating the data and sending it back to the client. Now, typically in web applications, this is bad for two major reasons. Number one, users typically expect immediate validation feedback. All right. In other words, if they have to send something to the client and the client works on it when it has time and sends something back, they don't want to wait half a minute before finding out that they made a mistake. The second thing is, let's say they have made a mistake. Why send something over to a server when it is an error? All right. So, again, what we're going to talk about now is known as client-side validation, and as you may or may not have guessed, it's implemented using JavaScript. The data the user has entered is validated before it's sent to the server. Now, it's important to realize that typically what's going to happen is when you are validating, you will first run client-side validation, supposing that the user has JavaScript enabled. And if everything passes, if all of your client-side validation tests pass, you'll send it to the server. And you'll run typically the same validation tests and maybe even more there. And the reason you do that is because it is possible for a user to have disabled JavaScript. So that's one way they could circumvent the system, they could get around it. So you want to make sure that doesn't happen. So, as mentioned here, I'm on the top of page 731, and I should say near the bottom of 731, about halfway down. The MVC framework supports unobtrusive client-side validation. Unobtrusive means the validation rules are expressed using attributes added to the HTML elements that the views generate. All right. They're interpreted by using the jQuery library, which does the actual work. So a lot of it is done and it's abstracted from you. It's done behind the scenes as long as you set it up correctly. So in the following sections, as the author mentions, he will show you how the built-in validation support works and demonstrates how it can be used. All right. Client-side validation is focused on validating individual properties. In fact, it's hard to set up model-level client-side validation. To that end, most MVC apps use client-side for property-level issues and rely on servers for the overall model. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to go into web config and make sure that both of these are on. I think they are, but just in case, I'll highlight them both. Go back to our project, go to our web config file, all right, where we have our add keys, client-side validation enabled, value is true, good. Unobtrusive JavaScript enabled, value true, good. So they're on here in here by default. Both of these settings must be true for client-side validation to work. All right. They do mention, and I should bring it up just for completeness sake, the tip that the author mentions right here. All right, that you can configure your client-side validation on a per view basis. All right. So next, adding the new get packages. I'm going to try this. I'm going to grab these 3 lines, copy them to the clipboard, because I've been burnt by this before. I'm going to come into here, put those lines in here. All right, install minus package jQuery minus version 1.0.2, install minus package jQuery.validation minus version 1.11.1, and install minus package Microsoft.jQuery.unobtrusive validation minus version 3. Again, I'm using the versions that the author has asked us to use. These are by no means the newest versions. In fact, I can tell you they're not. So let's see. Yeah. Here's our first, installing jQuery. Looks like it worked. Then the jQuery validation. Looks like it worked. Now the unobtrusive validation. And again, looks like it worked. All right. These packages add files to the script folder. So I probably should have given you a picture of that before we added it. Now we want to add script elements for the validation libraries to our layout _CS HTML file. That file is, come on, shown on screen here. All right. And the changes that we need to make are shown here. So right at the end of our head section, we want to add these script references. There's always been a big to-do over where you should add script tags. Should you put them in the head section or in the body section? The advantage of putting them in the head section is you can put them together and you can put them right under, which is what many people do, your CSS files. The advantage of putting them in the body is since the head loads first, if there's anything that needs to be loaded before you use this, you can always be assured it's been loaded. All right, so again, I'm going to come in here right at the bottom of my head section. We're going to add that. In the next chapter, that being chapter 26, the author is going to discuss the bundles feature, which makes it easier to manage JavaScript and jQuery files in a project. The order in which you add these is important. Validate depends on the jQuery library. Validate unobtrusive depends on validate, which depends on this. So you want to use this particular order when you put these in. All right. Then we want to go into the appointments file, appointments.cs, into our model. Now look, string length for client name, max is 10, minimum is 3. All right. So let's grab these two, which again is for client name, for date. In fact, we're going to grab everything, the entire namespace. And you can see how much smaller this is going to get, although it's only 39 lines to begin with. I mean, it's not like this is what we'd call humongous or anything. But we're going to grab that namespace that we've got in there right now, get rid of it, which cuts that down to 5 or 6 lines, and then just add about 10 lines. So the author says on the bottom of page 733, that's all we have to do to get the basic client-side validation working. We have applied a slightly different mix of built-in validation attributes so we can demonstrate some of the client-side validation features. Once you have the JavaScript libraries included in the HTML sent to the client, everything just starts to work. You can see the effect by starting the application. So let's do that. Always a good idea to first do a file save all. So we will start the application, iterate our way over to the /home/make booking, and entering the letter X into the name field, just an X. Moving on, and notice. All right, this is also shown on page 734, but it's the same thing. So we applied the string length validation attribute to the appointment class, okay, and saw the associated error. The feedback presented in the browser is immediate, which is good. All right. And you'll notice if I come in here and I type in, for example, YZ, now it went away because we've got 3 characters and that's the minimum. 2 again, it's bad. All right. Bottom of page 734. Understanding how client-side validation works. One of the benefits of using the MVC client-side validation framework is I don't have to write any JavaScript. Rather, the rules are expressed using HTML attributes. Sure, I'd agree. All right. The MVC client-side validation doesn't generate any JavaScript or JSON data to direct the validation process. Like the rest, pretty much, of the MVC framework, it relies on convention. Okay? All right. Avoiding conflicts with browser validation, middle of page 735. Some of the current generation of HTML5 browsers support simple client-side validation based on the attributes applied to input elements. In other words, HTML5 has its own built-in validation. The idea is, for example, an input element that is required something has to be put in there. One of the nice features, which is mentioned out here, one of the nice features about the MVC client-side validation is that the same attributes used to specify validation rules are applied at the client and at the server, meaning the data from browsers that do not support JavaScript are subject to the same validation as the ones that do. We already talked about that a little bit earlier. MVC client validation versus jQuery validation. The MVC client validation features are built on top of jQuery. If you prefer, you can use the validation library directly and ignore the MVC features. You may want to do that if you've done a lot of client-side work using the jQuery library. All right. There's even other things that you can do that are not discussed in this book. All right. So the last part of the chapter, which is on about the last 3+ pages, is on performing remote validation, which is the last feature we look at here. And I'm going to come back with that in the last lesson momentarily.